Welcome to another episode of Historical Markers. Today we're here on Tybee Island, as the sign behind me says, and we're looking at many of the historical markers. We've had a look at Fort Pulaski, which is basically on Tybee Island, very close to it, but the actual markers on Tybee Island are a little farther down. There's some down by the lighthouse and some others in the various areas around the island. So let's take a look at those and see what it will tell us. This marker talks about the roots of enslaved peoples, resistance, liberty, and heritage. The Middle Passage, Tybee Island, Georgia. It is a scar on the history of humanity. It is not a single race, religion, or country's responsibility to bear. It belongs to the world. The enslavement of Africans was a global system that lasted more than 300 years. The Middle Passage was the ocean route traveled by over 12 million kidnapped Africans who were marched to the African coast and transported to the Americas to begin their lives of enslavement. It is estimated that more than 2 million of the 12 million captive men, women, and children did not survive the 21 to 90-day voyage across the Atlantic. Each ship carried between 150 and 600 captives, and the average space allotted for each African was only 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and 3 feet high. Daily rations, if available, were often over only 1 liter of moldy water and rancid bug-infested food. Poor sanitary conditions, bad food and water caused extreme illness and death. The many who did not survive the deplorable conditions and violent abuse were thrown overboard without ceremony. Their watery graves marked the Middle Passage routes along the Atlantic from the coast of Africa to the North American mainland. Tybee Island was one of 91 coastal ports in the United States and its territories to which enslaved Africans arrived. The importation of Africans to the United States was officially outlawed in 1808. The UNESCO Routes of Enslaved People, Resistance, Liberty, and Heritage addresses the history of slave trade and slavery through the prism of intercultural dialogue, a culture of peace and reconciliation. It is this perspective that the project has created a label to encourage the preservation of sites, of memories, and establishments of itineraries that can tell this story and ensure that this heritage receives due attention at the national, region, and international levels. This site fulfills the quality criteria set by UNESCO in conjunction with the International Network of Managers of Sites and Itineraries of Memory. Tybee Island's main role in the Middle Passage was as a health and safety checkpoint for the incoming vessels of Savannah's burgeoning human trade. On August 8, 1750, 8 months after the colony of Georgia lifted its ban on owning Negro or black slaves, a lazaretto was commissioned to quarantine diseased crew members and enslaved Africans arriving by ship. In 1768, a building was constructed of tabby and lime brick on the western tip of Tybee to serve as a quarantine station to service any ships that were required to hold in place with disease on board. In early March of 1769, the ship Britannia arrived with enslaved Africans from Gambia. There was smallpox discovered on board. Georgia Colonel Governor James Wright ordered that the boat be moored in Tybee Creek and for all crew and enslaved Africans to remain in quarantine on Tybee for at least 40 days. Those coming ashore were restricted to remaining on the western tip of Tybee where the lazaretto was located. Burial instructions were also given for all such slaves or persons who may die on board or on shore during the quarantine hereby ordered be buried in some convenient place on the public land at least 5 feet beneath the surface. And then the marker behind this says the Middle Passage in Tybee Island, Georgia. In 2019, Tybee Island was designated a UNESCO Site of Memory as a documented transatlantic location where kidnapped African men, women, and children who survived the Middle Passage arrived. 53 ports line the coast of the continental United States from Maine to Texas, where captive Africans disembarked after their horrific journey across the ocean. The Middle Passage was a voyage lasting approximately 21 to 90 days that followed a path across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. Between 1795 and 1803, three ships departed Africa bound for Georgia and arrived at Tybee Island. Of the 796 captive Africans on board, 667 arrived and 129 perished. Tybee Island. Tybee Island was named by the Indians who came from the interior to hunt and fish. Settled since the beginning of the colony of Georgia, it was the scene of, in 1775, of the first capture by the first provincial vessel commissioned by any Congress in America for naval warfare in the Revolution, when a Georgia schooner captured an armed British vessel laden with military stores. In 1776, the royal governor, Sir James Wright, broke his parole and escaped to a British man of war in Tybee Roads. The Council of Safety ordered all Tybee houses sheltering British officers and Tories destroyed, and a raid on the island by the Patriot forces accomplished this purpose. In 1779, a large French fleet under Count d'Estaing anchored off Tybee for 2 months during the siege of Savannah by the French and American forces in the war between the states. Federal troops erected batteries here for the reduction of nearby Fort Pulaski. Troops were trained on Tybee Island during both World Wars. This marker on this rock is for Henry Sims Morgan, 2nd Lieutenant, Corps of Engineers. And if we look to the right here, here's a marker for Henry Sims Morgan. Graduated in the class of 1897 from West Point Academy, 2nd Lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. He was in charge of construction of a battery on Wassaw Island from 1897 to 1898. He drowned in 1898 while he and 5 other volunteers attempted to save the crew of the Italian bark No, and a small boat was launched in an attempt and it capsized. The HMS Otranto and Fort Screven on September 19th, 1918. 574 U.S. Army officers and enlisted men departed Fort Screven under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Samuel E. Levy to board the British troop ship HMS Otranto. The ship departed New York carrying more than 1,025 U.S. soldiers and crewmen bound for the battlefields of France. On October 6th, the Otranto was accidentally rammed by a sister ship near Islay, Scotland, in heavy seas. A heroic rescue attempt saved over 500 lives. However, 470 men perished, including 358 American servicemen. More than 130 casualties were from Georgia, including 11 from Chatham County. World War I officially ended November 11th, 1918. And then here's a larger marker talking about the loss of the HMS Otranto. And you can see some of the various pictures. Fort Screven. The legislature of Georgia in 1786 passed a law providing for a fort on Cockspur or Tybee Island to be named in honor of General James Screven, Revolutionary War hero. It was never built by the state. In 1808, the federal government obtained jurisdiction over the property on Tybee Island, now known as Fort Screven Reservation. Actual title was acquired in 1875, and the post, established in 1898, was in continuous use from the Spanish-American War through both world wars. Primarily a coast artillery fort, at one time Fort Fremont in South Carolina was under its jurisdiction. It became an infantry post and finally a school for deep-sea diving. Many distinguished officers saw duty here, including General George C. Marshall as colonel in command. In 1945, Fort Screven was declared surplus by the War Department and acquired by the town of Savannah Beach. Endicott period Battery Garland, 1899. One of the principal gun emplacements, Battery Garland, was armed with one 12-inch rifle gun on a non-disappearing barbette mount. Construction began in 1898. The gun was mounted in February of 1899. The battery was completed in March of 1899. 2 officers and 47 men were required for operation. The gun remained in use until 1942, after which it was melted down for reuse during World War II. Battery Garland was named for Brevet Brigadier General John Garland, who served in the War of 1812 and the Florida Seminole Indian War. The Tybee Island wade-ins. In early 1960s, Savannah Beach, now Tybee Island, Georgia, was the site of civil rights protests called wade-ins, akin to the sit-in demonstrations of the time. These protests, planned and conducted by the NAACP Savannah Youth Council, sought to challenge national Jim Crow laws, which were racial segregation laws which supported racial inequality and enforced racial segregation. These laws prohibited African Americans from equal access and enjoyment of the public beach. They protested by going to the beach and wading into the ocean. It says the first protest was in 1960. There were 27 people. The last wade-in was July 15th, 1963. 6 protesters were arrested for being on the beach and wading into the water. And then let's move over to this one. At a mass meeting of the Savannah NAACP WW Law Chapter President and local icon of the Civil Rights Movement praised the protesters. Because of potentially explosive racial tensions and anticipated large numbers of protesters, the Tybee prison camp, located near the present-day police station, had to be reopened. The success of the peaceful protest helped to convince Savannah community leaders to gather at the negotiating table to end segregation. On June 19, 2015, the Tybee Martin Luther King Human Rights Organization began an annual Juneteenth celebration to observe both the historic Tybee wade-ins and the first Juneteenth, June 19, 1865. It occurred in Galveston, Texas, where the last remaining enslaved African Americans in the United States finally learned from federal troops that they had been freed 2 years earlier by the Emancipation Proclamation. This marker is for the Leaman S. Memorial Garden in grateful recognition of those who give generously in time and service to the Tybee Museum. The first battery to be placed into service, it was fortified with 4 8-inch rifle guns mounted on disappearing mounts. After the firing, the recoil would lower the gun back down below the protective parapet. There the men could reload in relative safety and mechanically raise it to fire again. Construction began in April of 1897 and was completed in June of 1898. The guns weighed 32,000 pounds and had a firing range of about 10 miles. Operation required 4 officers and 157 men. In 1917, the guns were dismantled and shipped to Europe or melted down for other military purposes during World War I. Battery Brumby was named after Thomas M. Brumby, who served in the Spanish-American War under Admiral Dewey. And there's Battery Brumby, 1898. Well, that was a look at the markers at Tybee Island. I hope you found this interesting. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode of Historical Markers.